I've got an interesting news story for you today. You've heard of Riot Blockchain, right? They're a mining company with facilities in both the US and Canada. They're even publicly traded. Now, last month, when air conditioners were running at their peak in Texas, when energy demand was sky high, instead of mining Bitcoin, they powered down their equipment and received compensation from the state of Texas. The past month, they were paid some $9.5 million. Now, it's unclear whether the compensation was paid in cash. It may be credited later as electricity or something else. But it was reportedly greater than the market value of the Bitcoin they had mined the month before. Why am I telling you this? Because Texas has something called the Electric Reliability Council. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas has been quite proactive when it comes to Bitcoin mining these days. They make special agreements with mining companies. In order to mine Bitcoin stably, these miners need to secure enough electricity to power tens or even hundreds of thousands of homes. Now, since Texas has an abundance of energy, expanding power generation isn't all that difficult. The real question is whether it makes sense. Because Texas isn't densely populated, people are mostly concentrated in a few cities, with lots of small towns in between. But then, while energy usage is relatively low for most of the year, demand suddenly spikes in January or February when it's cold, and in the summer when it gets very hot. That means for most of the time, much of the power plants just sit idle. Because it's practically useless. During those times of underutilization, the power plants don't make sense. But Bitcoin miners kept pitching proposals. So now there is a collaboration between the Electric Reliability Council of Texas and companies like Riot Blockchain and Bitmain. Bitmain is Chinese and they've changed their name, which I mentioned in my book. Anyways, they're all working together in partnership now. So when there's surplus electricity, they mine Bitcoin. And when electricity is scarce, the miners shut down their operations. There's also probably some kind of ledger going back and forth. We can't get the full picture of the compensation system just from media reports. But it seems the local government provides compensation in exchange for shutting off electricity. When I was working on the revised edition of my book, I saw these companies' plans. They're seriously confident. They're confident that it's an end to Texas electricity problems. Why? Because since they need to consume enough electricity to power millions of households, they're planning to build enough power plants to match that capacity. Though it's not the case yet, if this happens, miners will be running power plants. Originally, power plants were looking to get into crypto mining. But because the crypto industry has so much capital, mining companies raise investments and build their own power plants. They use that electricity for mining. But when the city requests it, they pause mining for a month and supply power to the grid. So everyone wins. It's a win-win setup. So what do we call this? It's what I called the financialization of electricity last year. And it's happening now, right in Texas. The concept itself is simple enough, but it wasn't easy for people to accept. Partly because many people aren't familiar with macroeconomics. And the other reason, a lot of people don't really get how finance works. Why don't they understand finance? Because finance is a kind of system. And when we look at systems, we can look at them from a micro or macro perspective. A system seen from a micro level is totally different from one seen on a macro level perspective. As an individual micro level participant when seeing a system, the main point of interest is how you will win the game. But when you take a proper macro view of the system, who wins the game doesn't really matter. What matters is whether the system as a whole keeps running and achieves its overall purpose. And that's why financial and monetary systems look completely different depending on whether you view them from a macro or a micro perspective. This is what finance really is these days. Like the partnership between Texas's Electric Reliability Council and Riot Blockchain. From a macro perspective, this is the goal of finance, transferring surplus to where there is shortage. And later, when the shortage turns into surplus, returning it back. In simple terms, the macro level goal of finance is this continuous rebalancing of the books. But it's not easy. Why not? Because when people need something, they all tend to need it at the same time. And shortages hit everyone at once. That's demographics. Simply put, if the population maintains a pyramid structure, the working age group can continue using their income to raise children and support the elderly. Eventually, the elderly pass and the next generation transitions into that age group. The next generation needs to step in to support them. But now the demographic structure is changing. When baby boomers were working, there was an abundance of capital. But when they all get older, you're left with a society full of creditors that are just consuming, not producing. So from a macro perspective, the game simply doesn't work anymore. When this happens, micro-level individuals might respond by choosing stocks over pensions, or gold, or even Bitcoin instead. But from a macro view, it's still a closed system. There's no net gain or loss. Now here's the thing. When it comes to Bitcoin and the financialization of electricity, It is one of the most ideal models from a macroeconomic perspective. But the reason people miss the point about Bitcoin's role in energy finance is because they fail to see it from a macro perspective. They're stuck viewing it microscopically. That's why it goes into an ethical question. People argue Bitcoin itself is wasteful. How can energy become financialized? But I've said this before. Even if Bitcoin were completely useless, we should invent something like it anyway. If there are diehard fans who believe it has value, and if it's traded among themselves, those that run macroeconomics can say, though I don't agree with Bitcoin, since those enthusiasts are into it, I'll mine some with my excess electricity and sell it to them. And when they need my electricity, since I've got bargaining power, I can just say, hey, stop using electricity, I need it now. But because their collapse isn't an option, and since they're a bumper, we give them some so they don't collapse. Later, when we've got surplus power again, we offer it to them at a discount. If I didn't build the power plant myself, but they did, offer them subsidies, or give them tax breaks, something to keep the system going. Why? Because Bitcoin mining is, surprisingly, perfectly flexible. That's why Bitcoin mining is not affected even if one city shuts it down. It does not affect total Bitcoin mining at all, because the Earth is round, with latitudes and longitudes. Rush hours and peak demand shift around the world throughout the day. So power shortages affect one region after the other, and so do electricity surpluses. Even the seasons flip between hemispheres, though flat earthers might disagree, but that's beside the point. Summer in the south, winter in the north, and time zones all vary too. How ideal is that? So when people debate Bitcoin's utility, they're speaking from a micro-individual point of view. From a macroeconomic perspective, it's an almost flawless financial tool. Honestly, it's so close to perfect that nothing else even comes close to challenging it. It actually does what neither money nor banks can do. The reason why banks can't do it, look at it this way. When market advocates talk, there are various players and different time horizons. So for every seller, there's a buyer, and it all balances out. But that's just textbook theory. In real life, in your experience of the market, everyone sells at once, everyone buys at once. That's why there are spikes, crashes, panics, bubbles, overheating markets, and eventually a collapse. Now, compared to that, Bitcoin mining is way more predictable and actually makes sense. So if you're not using it, if public institutions like national electric companies ignore it, it's not just ignorance, but as elites within a nation, they're actively committing crimes to their country's economy. That's my view. We have it, so why not use it? Unless you think Bitcoin is absolutely evil. If you're not that convicted, there are pros and yes, ransomware too, but that's not my problem. The key is that because Bitcoin miners are extremely flexible consumers, and power plants are inevitably built for peak demand, since they have spare electricity for Bitcoin during off-peak times, and that causes a fuss, they let them mine with idle equipment. That's the kind of give and take between Texas's Energy Reliability Council and miners. You build the power plants. They build and run them in places that lack electricity, and the city buys it when they need it. Isn't that kind of setup just perfect? There's no finer refrigerator that humanity has ever built. No finer hammerstone we've ever created. We have tried, but they've always had internal contradictions. They never reached true equilibrium. So governments always had to step in. And that's why we're left in this mess we see today. Now everyone is watching the chair of the Federal Reserve as if he's some kind of high priest of natural law. But electricity varies by season, by time zone. We're not going to all use or not use it by waiting for someone to say something. How perfect is that? At the very least, compared to the current dollar-centered reserve system, Bitcoin can move us toward equilibrium far more effectively. All right, let's wrap it up here. It's hot out. Stay healthy, and thank you.